refreshed after a meal, and I hope you're not too sleepy after a meal. If I see anybody dozing, I'll call on you to answer a question.
There you go.
After going through the Bible in that research project and discovering lots of things that it said that I did not know it said before, and discovering that what I thought it said, it didn't really mean when you look at how it interprets itself, then the next question that came to my mind was, if this is what the Bible really teaches, where did the other idea come from, and why does everybody think that's the way it is? So the second part of my study was going through church history, and the second part of the Fire That Consumes is going through church history to see where the other idea of eternal conscious torment came from and why so many people believe that today. And that was full of surprises as well. It was full of surprises because the doctrine came from and was passed down not because of Bible teaching, but because of Greek philosophy, because of medieval theories of justice, because of Reformation politics, and because of sectarian prejudices in centuries that followed. And we'll look at all those things briefly in this third talk today. So where did the idea of unending torment come from? In one statement, it's summed up like this, that it came from pagan Greek philosophy's immortality of the soul doctrine versus the Bible teaching of divine creation. Next slide. Socrates and his pupil Plato and his successor Aristotle, along with many other Greek philosophers, taught something that many of us grew up hearing and thinking came from the Bible, but actually is not found in the Bible and came from pagan Greek philosophy. And that is the teaching of the immortality of the soul. When I was a kid, I can remember in revival meetings the preacher saying everybody has an immortal soul that will spend eternity either in heaven or in hell. And I just thought, well, if the preacher said it must be so, and it must be in the Bible somewhere. But what I discovered was, upon thorough study, the Bible never teaches that everybody has an immortal soul. In fact, the Bible never teaches that anybody has an immortal soul, except as God makes us immortal through His gift of salvation. Socrates and Plato and other Greeks, however, many other Greeks, not all of them, did believe in the immortality of the soul, and this is what they meant by that expression. They believed that the human being has two main parts which can be separated, and one is the body, which is made of earthly elements and which is mortal, meaning that it's capable of dying. And then they believe that the body is inhabited like a cage, like a squirrel in a cage. Inside our body there's living something they refer to as the immortal soul. And they believe that souls had always existed from eternity and would always continue to exist. And they believe that when you are born, a little bit of this immortal soul that's out there wherever souls come from comes into your body and gives your body life. And that's the real part of you, and that's the part of you that will live forever. And the body is like a cage that the soul is in. And when you die, the soul leaves the body, and the body perishes, and the soul goes back to where souls came from, and is immortal, meaning it cannot die. So immortal just means cannot die or deathless. Mortal means capable of death or something that can die. I remember when I was doing this research, one particular day I took a break and was walking around the block near our house in Alabama, and my best friend from third grade forward, who I thought was going to be here today, Joel, you let me down, lived down the street from me, and he was out in his yard, and he said, "What are you working on?" And I told him because he knew the general project. I said, "I was just working today on the idea of the immortal soul." And he said, "By the way, where did that idea come from?" I said, "Well, it's interesting you would ask right now because I was just reading about that." And I was actually reading in a work called the Phaedo, P-H-A-E-D-O, written by Plato, and it's about the death of Socrates. And when Socrates was condemned by the Athenians for teaching new ideas, basically, and drank the hemlock and died as his way of execution, he had his disciples gathered around him, his philosopher students, and he talked to them about life and death. And he was trying to encourage them not to feel sorry for him because he was about to go back to where immortal souls came from, and they had to still live in their mortal bodies, and that was a terrible kind of thing to be putting up with. But he said the true philosopher is happy when he thinks of death, because that's freeing the soul from the body, and the soul can go back to where it came from. That's where the idea of immortal soul started. The Greek philosophers, at least in that form. Next slide. The Bible teaches, on the other hand, that the whole person, the whole human being, is totally mortal, capable of death, capable of destruction, capable of dying, no inherent ability to live forever by itself, only if God enables us to live forever. And I think the earliest way to describe a human being's makeup is found in the creation story in Genesis 2:7, when it says, the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. In the King James it says, man became a living soul. Genesis 2:7. So in this picture of the creation of man, we start with the earth body that's made from elements of the ground, the body, the physical body. And God breathed into Adam's physical body the breath of life. Breath is spirit. In Hebrew, the word is ruach, R-U-A-H. In Greek, the word is pneuma. And our word pneumonia and pneumatic and so forth come from that word, meaning air. The word for soul in Hebrew is nephesh, N-E-P-H-E-S-H. And in Hebrew, it's psyche, P-S-Y-C-H-E. And our word psychology and psyche and all the words that connect to that come from that word. But in Hebrew and in Greek and in Latin and in English and in many other languages, I'm quite sure, the word for spirit is the same as the word for wind and the same as the word for breath. And Jesus makes a play on this word in John 3, talking to Nicodemus, when he says the wind blows where it wishes, and you don't know, you hear the sound of it, but you don't know, you can't see it and so forth. He says, so is everyone who's born of the Spirit. And when he said that, he used the same word for wind and for spirit, because it's the same word in Greek. And so in the Bible, Old and New Testament alike, breath and wind and spirit all are the same word with different connotations. And when God breathed into Adam's body the breath of life, that's the wind of life or the spirit of life, or what it turns out in the Old Testament, the first several chapters of Genesis, animals are also said to have the breath of life. In the flood, everything was destroyed that had the breath of life, including the animals as well as man. So breath of life is not anything unique to human beings. It's in all living creatures that are animated. Animated means it has breath, and because they're animated, we refer to them as animals. So we are an animal also because we're animated, because we are animal, and we have wind and breath and life, and that's what gives our body the ability to function and all of that. So Adam is made out of dust of the earth. We got a mud man, breathes breath of life, and he becomes, not has, he becomes a living soul or living being. And the word living soul is also used of animals as well as man in the Old Testament. And later in the Old Testament, we read in some places about dead souls. And it just means dead beings, dead people, dead creatures, dead whole beings. So basically the human being from the earliest part of the Old Testament consists of a physical, visible, tangible, earthly body, animated or given breath or life or wind by God's breath of life and their spirit. And then that makes us turn into a living being or living soul, which can function until the breath of life leaves us. And when the breath of life leaves us, then our body is dead because the life force is gone, and we go back to the elements of the earth, and the breath or wind or spirit returns to God who gave it. But the Bible never talks about the soul returns to God, because the soul is not something by itself. The soul is what we are as a whole person, a whole being, a living soul. So this is the beginning of the Bible's teaching on soul and breath and spirit and wind and all of that. As you go through the Bible, sometimes soul is used in a way almost that covers what we just talked about, spirit. Sometimes spirit is used in a way that seems to be what we just talked about as soul. Sometimes they're used in other ways besides that. And it's very difficult. And in fact, I'm not able to say that here is a single definition throughout the whole Bible that always is what soul means or always what spirit means. There's a lot of variation about those words. But in the beginning and at the very start, this picture we just looked at is the way it all begins. Okay, next slide, please. Rather than teaching that every human being has an immortal soul, what the Bible really teaches is that only God is immortal within himself. And again, mortal means capable of dying, and immortal means incapable of dying, cannot die. 1 Timothy 6:16 speaks of God who alone possesses immortality and dwells in unapproachable light. God only has immortality. God is the only being in the universe who of his own self lives forever. That's not true of human beings. We did not exist until we were created by God. We do not exist today except as God continues to give us life. And when we die, we're dead forever unless God raises us back from the dead, which he said he will do. And we will have no hope of living in eternity unless God makes us immortal. So we are mortal creatures. We're made of dust. And Longfellow was wrong when he said, "Dust thou art, to dust returneth," was not spoken of the soul. It was spoken of the whole human being, because the soul is the person, the animated body, the living creature. As a matter of fact, if you look through the Bible in terms of the use of the word immortality as it applies to human beings, immortal or immortality, which again means deathlessness or deathless, the only time those words are ever used of human beings are as follows. They are always used of the saved, never used of the lost. 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the believers who will be raised immortal, incorruptible, and we'll have a body that's characterized by power, by glory, by all of these words. That's not talking about the lost. Nowhere in 1 Corinthians 15 is a description of the resurrection of the lost. The Bible never says anything about the lost being raised immortal. Every time it speaks of immortality, it's the righteous who by patience and good works seek after glory and honor and immortality, and will be given immortality and eternal life. So the human immortality is always the saved, never the lost. In the second place, it's always speaking of the whole person, never of a disembodied soul or spirit. Although the popular culture talks about immortal souls, whenever the Bible talks about human beings being immortal or having immortality, it's always the whole person. In the resurrection, when our body is recreated out of God's great memory bank, and then the body is reunited with the breath of life in an immortal form, and we put on immortality, and we put on clothed in immortality, and we're ready to live with God forever in new heavens and new earth. So it's always the saved, never the lost, always the whole person, never a disembodied soul or spirit. And in the third place, immortality for humans is always in the resurrection, and after that, never of now, never of creation. And although many people believe it, they are mistaken when they think that God created, destroyed forever and ever. That would be infinite punishment. So his reasoning doesn't even follow, but that's the way he reasoned. So Anselm came up with that doctrine, and that's still taught today by traditionalist authors and advocates who will often make that very same argument that Anselm made. A century or two later, Aquinas, the sometimes called the angelic doctor, he was a great theologian of the Catholic Church, and he talked about the soul and the body, and he reasoned like this. He said, what the body does on earth in life is animated by the soul and prompted by the soul. So if your body sins, it's because your soul kind of motivated it to do that, and your soul was working through your body. He, of course, believed in the soul being immortal and the body being mortal. So he said, therefore, since the soul is the most guilty of the two, the soul has to be punished more than the body does, which he said meant that when you die, your soul goes straight to hell if you're to be punished, and it starts suffering then, but your body only comes after the resurrection and joins it, and then it gets in on the suffering for the rest of eternity. But he came up with all kind of ideas like this as well, and many of these things are still taught. In fact, the idea that when you die you go immediately to heaven or hell probably came from Anselm and Aquinas and people of their era, and not from the Bible. The Bible picture is rather that all people who die are dead, until Jesus comes again. And at the end of the world, there will be a general resurrection, and all people will be raised from the dead, as in Daniel 12:1 and 2, and John chapter 5, the resurrection of life and the resurrection of condemnation. The righteous are raised immortal, the wicked are raised mortal. The righteous go into eternal life with God, the wicked go into the lake of fire, which is the second death. So the Bible really seems to teach that when we die, we're just dead until Jesus comes. Then we wake up again and we're in the resurrection. When you die, to you, it seems like the next second, because just like when you go to sleep at night, you're not aware of any passing of time until you wake up again. Next slide, please. The Reformation comes along about 1,000 years after Augustine. So we skipped 1,000 years here. It's a good thing because we've got about 5 minutes or 10 left. Luther you've heard of, and Calvin you've heard of, and the Anabaptists you've probably heard of. Some of you know the name of John Tyndale from his translation of the English Bible, and Sir Thomas More was famous as the man for all seasons. But Luther questioned some of the philosophical proofs for the doctrine of the soul, immortality of the soul. In fact, in one of his writings, Luther said that the philosophical proofs or arguments for the immortality of the soul belong on the great dung heap of Roman decretals. And he was his usual tactful self in saying that. Luther questioned the immortality of the soul, in other words. Luther at times talked about the soul being alert and awake all the time between death and the resurrection. But at other times he talked about the soul sleeping. And he said of himself that when he died, he said, I shall lie down and sleep until my Lord Jesus comes back and knocks at the door of my little tomb. It says, Dr. Luther, wake up, and then I shall rise and be happy with him forever. And I think that's a beautiful statement, a picture. Anyway, when Luther was saying that, meanwhile there was this group of people called Anabaptists, and the Anabaptists were neither Catholic nor Protestant like Luther and Calvin. They were radical reformers. They had such radical notions as there shouldn't be a state church, and everybody who's born in the country shouldn't be baptized as a baby and automatically be considered a Christian. They thought there was a connection between faith and Christianity, and that you should be a committed believer before you're part of the visible church. Well, especially because they rejected the state church, which Calvin and Luther both believed in. They were hated and hunted and persecuted and prosecuted and put to death by everybody else. The Catholics persecuted them, the Reformers persecuted them, the Lutherans persecuted them, and one way they've sometimes executed them was drown them, because they taught that people who were baptized as babies need to be baptized again as adults, and for that reason they were named the Anabaptists, or the Again Baptists, the baptized over again people. And sometimes their opponents would take them and tie them up and dump them in the river and say, if you like water so much, we'll give you a dunking you'll never forget, and drown them. So these were the radical reformers. Some of these Anabaptists were teaching that the soul is mortal, that human beings are mortal. They taught conditional immortality, that only those who are saved and given immortality by God will be made immortal. And when the wicked die, they're dead. And when they're raised from the dead, they'll be put in the lake of fire and be in the second death and gone forever. That's what some of the Anabaptists were teaching. Calvin, when he was in his 20s, began to write. He had been trained as a lawyer as well. But Calvin's first theological book was a book called Psychopanachia, which is a Greek word that means the soul stays awake all night long. And this book was basically a vitriolic harangue against the Anabaptists, because they're teaching that the wicked are destroyed in hell and the wicked don't have an immortal soul. Calvin, as was customary for his day, didn't spare any words in this, and so when he writes about the Anabaptists, he'll say things like this. He says, the cursed Catabaptists, whose very name is to damn anything that they say, they'll say such and such. Or he'll say, this doctrine which lately spewed forth from the pits of hell, etc., etc. And that's the kind of tone he has all through this book, damning the Anabaptists for teaching that man is not immortal naturally. All right, so we got the Anabaptists, some of them teaching the mortality of man and the destruction of the wicked. We got Luther kind of sympathetic to that point of view. Then here comes John Calvin just blasting with all his 6 shooters every direction, won't have anything to do with it and be damned with anybody who does. And that's John Calvin. When that happened, Luther some of Luther's friends said Calvin's kind of getting worked up about this, and Luther backed off the subject and didn't want to split the Reformation over what he considered a minor point. So Luther kind of got quiet. John Calvin never did get quiet, and he kept teaching what he was teaching. And because of that, you end up with the Catholics against the Anabaptists, Calvin's against the Anabaptists, and Luther being quiet. And guess who won? Well, of course, it was Calvin and the Catholics carried the day, and the Anabaptists got hushed up, and that was the way that went. So Calvin was very important in perpetuating the doctrine of eternal torment. Although Calvin himself, in his writings, and in my appendix at the back of The Fire That Consumes, I go into many details about this with direct quotes and sources that they come from. Calvin himself taught that human beings only have life because God gives us life. And he said if God withdrew His grace of life for even one moment, we would totally cease to exist. And he believes that in the end of the world, the only reason we have life forever is because God gives it to us. So he was really a conditional, immoral person when he got right down to it. But when he talked about hell, he forgot that he said all that. And he begins to reason from the immortality of the soul and do just like Augustine had done before him. And so Calvin ends up really pressing that point very hard. Meanwhile, in England, and I left out a little detail here, in England already when Luther was teaching his stuff, Tyndale, well, actually Sir Thomas More first, a Catholic, Sir Thomas More in England was a Catholic, began to oppose Luther's teaching publicly. And when he did that, Tyndale, who was what will later be called a Protestant, Tyndale came to Luther's defense, and he said the Bible teaches that that man has immortality as a gift of God, but the Pope, substituting popish doctrines for the Word of God, teacheth that man is immortal. And so Tyndale took up with Luther, and then Calvin came out against all of that. There was another man who was on Calvin's side named Heinrich Bullinger. And in England, when Bloody Mary was queen and persecuting Protestants, many Protestants fled to the continent for safety, and they went to Geneva and other places on the continent where they bumped into the teaching of John Calvin and of Heinrich Bullinger. Bullinger wrote what was one of the earliest Protestant creeds called the Second Helvetic or Swiss Confession. I believe it was 1586, somewhere within a few years of there. And he wrote into this confession of faith the doctrine of the immortality of the soul and eternal torment. So when these Protestants who escaped from England to Europe were being taught over there, they were taught these things. When they came back to England after Mary was gone and the Protestants were in charge again, they brought these doctrines back with them. And when they later wrote the Westminster Confession, they incorporated into their confession of faith the same teachings that Heinrich Bullinger had put in his confession of faith. This becomes part of the teaching of the Scottish Presbyterians and later the Puritans in England. And when they come to America, they bring this doctrine with them. Until the time most of us were grown, Christian people in general did not want to say anything questioning the traditional doctrine of hell out loud, because there's somebody going to jump on you and say, well, you sound like a Jehovah's Witness, or you sound like an Adventist, or whatever. Then there's one other very important thing. In the early years of the 20th century, 1910, 1912, thereabouts, there were written a group of, I think, 6 books called the Fundamentals, which were the fundamentals of the Christian faith. These were basically written by scholars who taught at Princeton Seminary, which in those days was conservative, and they were distributed to preachers all over the United States free of charge. One of the teachings of, 2 of the teachings of this series of books, the Fundamentals, were the immortality of the soul and the eternal torment of the wicked. In opposition to the fundamentalists were people who denied those things, but they also denied that there was a hell at all, and they also denied that Jesus was really the Son of God. They denied miracles, and they denied creation, and they denied the inspiration of the Bible, and they didn't believe in a literal resurrection, and they didn't believe in heaven and hell. And these people were referred to as modernists. So there came to be test sheets that people would give to preachers or other Bible teachers, if you're going to hire somebody or be associated with them, they give them their doctrinal test sheet to see if they were sound or not. And included in those doctrines would always be, do you believe in a literal hell? Do you believe the wicked will suffer eternal torment forever? And if you said no, they say, aha, you must be a modernist. So nobody wanted to be a modernist, so you didn't talk about it in those days either. This doesn't sound real nice, but I think in context it makes sense. Somebody defined the difference between a modernist and a fundamentalist. A modernist said there ain't no hell, and the fundamentalist said the hell there ain't. But that's kind of, it was pretty tough head-on conflict, and it was very dangerous to express your views out loud if you didn't agree with the eternal doctrine of eternal torment. It was kind of interesting, about 1840, 1850, there was a man in the movement I come from in the Church of Christ named Moses Lard, who wrote a book called Eternal, I believe is the name of it, in which he says that the Bible's words translated eternal do not necessarily mean unending, but rather mean longer than the eye can see the end to, and is age-lasting or something like that. And in his book, he makes the statement something along these lines. He says in the preface, the times are not right now for men to consider with open mind the things I'm saying in this book. But he either said I predict or I prophesy. He didn't claim to be a prophet, but he used one of those words that 100 years from now, tempers will be different, and this subject will be studied open-mindedly. Well, a friend who was a great traditionalist preacher sent me a copy of Laird's book when I was doing my research, and I was fascinated to see that Laird, who said this about 100 years from now, either wrote that book 100 years before the year I was born, or he wrote it 100 years from the time I was writing this Fire That Consumes. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good guess that the times will change in 100 years. And as it's happened with InterVarsity Press, particularly printing the two views of hell, on the back of which they say evangelical Christians hold two views, and they make it sound like they're equally valuable and valid, and you might be one or you might be the other, and it's okay either way. That just flew in the face of all the traditionalist people who thought this was horrible, and they couldn't stand the idea that InterVarsity is giving some credence to this view that they considered heretical. But that's the way it happened. And these days, the Advent people who have always taught conditional immortality are kind of upset. I mean, they're not upset. They're happy that so many people are coming to accept this teaching of conditional immortality. But at the same time they're happy, they're also a little bit unhappy, because it's like this was our doctrine for the last 125 years, and we were persecuted standing alone for this teaching, and now other people are saying it, and kind of they stole our thunder, and why do we even exist any longer if everybody's coming to think this way? It's kind of like charismatic and Pentecostal people would be when the other Christians and other denominations and groups accept the gifts of the Spirit and things like that. And if I tell you that a lot of Church of Christ people are open to that these days, you could start saying, well, I'm glad to hear it. Then you could start saying, well, I don't know if I'm glad or not. I'd rather keep that for Pentecostals. Well, the truth is, all truth is for all God's people. And everybody needs to share in the good stuff everybody else has. So that's kind of what happened. Next slide. We're running out of steam and running out of time. I've already talked about guilt by association, and that was a great factor. Next slide. Sometimes people today will say that nobody of any significance or influence or reputation holds to these views that I've been presenting here this morning. These are some of the people. F.F. Bruce was a Brethren scholar in England in his time. He's now deceased, but in his time he was probably the greatest New Testament scholar living. He wrote the foreword to The Fire That Consumes. He actually says in the foreword that as I define the terms, he is neither a conditionalist nor a traditionalist, but he said he takes the position of David will not the judge of all the earth do right, and he just leaves it open for God, but he doesn't believe in eternal torment. Michael Green was a great Anglican theologian who's still living. At one time he was the spiritual advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury. He wrote a book called Evangelism in the Early Church that's a classic on that subject. He teaches conditional immortality. Philip E. Hughes was another Anglican scholar who taught for several years at Westminster Theological Seminary. Westminster is Presbyterian. They're in the very core of the people who defend traditional teaching. But Philip E. Hughes, who taught there, in his book, one of his books teaches conditional immortality. W. Graham Scroggie was a British evangelical associated with the Holiness Movement and the Keswick Movement, and he taught conditional immortality. Dale Moody for 40 years was the chief Bible teacher at Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville. He's now dead, but when I was writing my book, he was still living. And I talked to him on the phone one day, and he said, I taught this for 40 years at Southern Baptist, and he believed that the conditional immortality was true. Clark Pinnock, who's written many books, is a Canadian Baptist, good friend of mine, and Clark has done a lot to put this teaching in the mainstream. John Wenham was a great Oxford scholar and Anglican priest and New Testament scholar, and he believed this so strongly that when he wrote his autobiography before he died, he titled his autobiography Facing Hell. And he said throughout his entire ministry he had been greatly troubled by what he considered the horrible teaching of hell. It was the popular view, and he considered his life worthwhile if he could do anything to help abolish that teaching. One little quick aside about John Wenham. He was in his 80s when he died a few years ago. In about 1999 or something like that, 97 perhaps, I was contacted by Paternoster Press in Great Britain, who had been F.F. Bruce's publisher in England, and they said we would like permission to produce a British edition of The Fire That Consumes. And they said the way this came about, they had gone to John Wenham and said, would you write a book setting out the biblical basis for conditional immortality? And Wenham said, the book is already written, it's The Fire That Consumes. And so they came and asked for permission to do that, which they did. And they met me at InterVarsity Press in Chicago and tried to get InterVarsity to co-publish it. InterVarsity said, we don't want to do that, but we would be interested in a Two Views book. So that's how the Two Views on Hell came about as a result of that conversation. Gordon Wenham, another scholar, is John Wenham's son. He teaches this view. Earl Ellis taught at Southern Baptist Seminary in Fort Worth until very recently. He holds this view. John Stott, who's been called the Dean of Evangelical Preachers and was one of the most highly revered evangelical scholars and preachers in the world today, has published this view. Since then, he got so much flack that he did not want to jeopardize a mission project he was involved in, and so he's kind of backed off a little bit and says now he's an agnostic on the subject, but he really, I think, secretly still believes it. Homer Haley, as I mentioned already, LaGard Smith, a Church of Christ man of great influence, is an Irishman by the name of Jim McGuigan. He holds this view and told me that he did from the time the book came out. Ed Wharton, a very conservative Church of Christ preacher and teacher, was in a meeting in Katy, Texas, where I lived several years ago. I gave him a copy of the book and said I would appreciate it if you would read this and tell me what you think of it. He called me back on the phone a year later and said, I apologize for being so late getting back to you, but I didn't want to call you until I had something to criticize, and I can't find anything I disagree with. So he's on the same side there with this teaching. And the list could go on and on and on with many others. But if anybody ever says nobody except cults or weirdos or extremists or flakes or whatever believe this teaching, you can just say, well, I know that's not true. They're some of the most highly respected people. And then there's some disrespectable ruffians like myself who are part of the number as well. But these are some of the ones. Is there another slide, or is that the end of it? All right, that's the end of it. So in a nutshell, that's kind of where it came from and how I got here today. I hope in spite of having a good meal and I'm sure being sleepy and me not having a very good speaking voice, that you're able to stay awake and get something out of that. And I appreciate you being here. Thank you for your wonderful attention. You've been very kind to me. And I again thank Pastor Farmer for inviting me in the first place. If you want to take over and do any questions, it's 10 after.